Good morning, friends. It's Saturday. We made it through another work week, and I'm back with Chapter 4 of Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Debriefing. I woke to the feeling that something was poking my cheek. Before I even opened my eyes, I rubbed my cheek and felt something scratch the back of my hand on the pillow. I carefully rubbed at the spot with a finger and felt a small stick or sticker poking through the white with blue striped covering. Curious, I looked down and saw something sticking out. I picked at it a minute and then, squeezing with my fingernails, slowly pulled it from the pillow. As it emerged through the tightly woven threads, it puffed up, and I could see it was a feather. Cool. I lay back, looking at the feather and then the room around me. The walls were white-painted plaster, and the floor was wood planking. A single light bulb hung on a wire from the ceiling, which was also white-painted plaster. Across the room, there was a door I assumed was the closet in the corner, and next to this sat a very large dresser with a mirror on top. The mirror was dirty. Not just dusty, but rather it seemed to have an ages-old coating of dirt, which made the reflection of the room around me seem to be dark, though the room was fairly brightly lit by the light coming in the window next to the headboard of the bed. I threw the bedspread off of myself, noticing it was quite heavy, and realized it was cold in the room. I breathed out to test the air and could see my breath. Getting up from the bed, I put my shoes on and walked to the window. Looking out, I saw the window was dirty like the mirror and breathed on it before wiping at it with my shirt sleeve. It was quite dirty, as evidenced by the sudden brightness now pouring through the glass. I looked out past the small side yard and my father's truck to see the outhouse and Fort Stix in the field. I remembered I still needed a door for my fort and wondered if maybe I could find something in the house. Seeing nothing which would suffice in the bedroom, I opened the door and entered the living room. It felt like I had stepped back in time. The flower patterns on the furniture and throw rug on the wood floor had a distinct look of the far past, as did the old foot-pedal sewing machine which sat in the corner. Most notable was the old-time radio against the wall and the lack of a television. The window in this room was also dirty, with yellowed lace curtains hanging to either side. In the big family room where the potbelly stove sat, there was nothing but the dining room chairs we had sat on the previous night, and a couple of paper grocery bags full of empty beer cans. I explored the canned foods in the pantry, but found nothing that interested me for breakfast, so I headed for the kitchen. The cupboards were pretty much bare except for some spices, a can of baking powder, and a few dishes, so I checked out the refrigerator. I found a small plate with some of the patty cakes and sausages from the night before, and grabbed one each of these. Even cold, it was good, and I turned from the kitchen while eating it to look at the basement door. My grandmother's house in Lake Station also had a basement where I loved spending time. It was unfinished, but the concrete floor was kept reasonably clean, and it provided a nice open area where I could build with blocks and set up racetracks without being underfoot of my grandparents. I spent many happy hours there, except at night. I did not like being alone in the basement at night for two reasons. First, without the light coming in from the transom windows to help the poor lighting, it was very dark with lots of deep shadows. Shadows that seemed to move on their own and watch me. Second, the transom windows were dark, and even at a young age I understood that I could be seen by whatever was outside those windows, but I could not see what was looking at me. It gave me a shudder just thinking about what might have been watching me. Looking at the basement door, I wondered if I was about to discover my very own favorite play place, since we'd never had a house with a basement before. Popping the last of my breakfast in my mouth, I walked over and grabbed the knob. It turned easily, but the door wouldn't open. I could see in the crack that the deadbolt was engaged, but there was no key in the lock. I looked around and saw a skeleton key hanging from a nail in the kitchen next to the medicine cabinet by the back door. I grabbed the key and tried it. The lock turned, and I pulled the door open. I was greeted by my old nemesis, darkness. I looked at the front and back doors to either side, as if to build my reserve of light, and then back at the narrow corridor to the basement. I found a light switch on one side and flipped it on. A dim light began to glow at the base of the stairs from somewhere within the basement behind the stairs, as each tread lit up below me. I carefully descended the stairs slowly, making sure to allow enough time for any unwanted ghosts or mythical creatures to return to their hiding places so I would not see them. There was an old pistol hanging on the headboard of the stairs above me as I descended, but I left it be, knowing I would be able to look at it later after I showed it to my dad. I was well trained in shooting and handling of firearms, but I was not allowed to touch them unless my dad was there with me. That was one rule I would never break, as I did not want to lose my privileges to handle guns and shoot. At the bottom of the stairs, I stood and looked around. It was rather disappointing. The room was about half the size of the family room above, and the walls were made of roughly mortared stone. It was more like the inside of a well than a basement. The floor wasn't even concrete, but rather dirt. I looked around quickly, and seeing nothing I could use for Fort Stix, turned and left. I closed and locked the basement door to prevent my brother from opening it and possibly falling down the stairs. Then I hung the key where I found it and stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was just barely over the trees, but as it shone on me on the back porch, I soaked up the warmth as I surveyed my new domain. The woods seemed to call to me, and I saw the path going down to my grandfather's house through the side woods, but I was on a mission. I needed a door for Fort Stix. I saw nothing from the back porch all the way to the woods except weeds and grass. Looking toward the field, it occurred to me that I had found one pile of wood out there. Maybe there would be another. Or maybe I would even find the door for my fort laying in the field. Hopeful, I headed that way. Walking the perimeter of the field at the edge of the woods, I found several trails leading into the trees, which I assumed were made by deer and other animals. At one point, I even found a large section of trees with many vines hanging from them. I was unsure what they were until I finally found a small bunch of old raisins from the previous year and recognized them as grapevines. I knew this because my grandmother in Lake Station had grapevines on trellis in her backyard. But there was no more wood, nor a door for my fort. Lots of old auto parts like fenders and hoods from old trucks, but not a single piece of good wood anywhere. I headed for the outhouse to do my morning business and think about it for a minute. Emerging from the outhouse, I was standing beside it, looking at the fort, when I put my arm out to lean against the outhouse. The wood I put my hand on fell away, and I fell to the ground. Gathering myself and climbing to my feet, I wondered what happened. I looked at the outhouse, and it looked okay, but now, laying on the ground behind it, was what looked to be a door for the outhouse without the opening. I looked at it, then to my fort, and realized it was the perfect size for Fort Stix. I grabbed it up and took it to the fort. Standing it in place, it was a perfect fit. I looked inside to find the hammer and nails, but stopped as I reached for them. I couldn't just nail the door on. How would it open? I needed some hinges. A new challenge had been presented: where to find hinges. I looked around the farm, and my eyes settled on the old garage. Of course, the garage, home of tools and supplies. I quickly headed for my new destination. The bees greeted me casually by buzzing around my ears and hovering close to watch as I removed the board once again to enter the garage. None of them touched me, and I figure they must have recognized me and realized I was not there to bother them, but they were just curious to see what I was doing. As I slipped into the garage once again, my eyes were able to look deeper into the wall with the rising sun shining directly on this wall. I paused to take in what I was seeing. In the space between the inner and outer walls, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of honeybees and a very large honeycomb. That's why they were keeping such a close eye on me. They thought I might be after their honey. I love honey, and knew fresh honey is best of all, but I didn't know how to go about getting it from the bees without getting stung. I made a mental note to research this when I got back to school so I could get some fresh honey later. I slipped into the garage and set about looking for a pair of hinges for my door. I found several pairs laying on a bench covered with about 100 years worth of dust, so I knew they wouldn't be missed when I took a matched pair. I made sure they worked freely and stuck them in my back pocket. Since that task was completed so quickly, I took a few moments to look around and see if there was anything else in the garage that belonged in Fort Stix. With the excitement at having found fresh honeycombs, it didn't even occur to me to look for ghosts or mythical creatures in the shadows this time. It was also possible that I forgot because the eastern sun made the garage much more bright than the first time I was here, and I could see better. Either way, I realized I had made a mistake when I suddenly heard a loud groan and the door of the garage began to shudder and shake violently. I froze in place and looked around for someplace safe to hide. Whatever was trying to get in the garage must have smelled me because it was trying very hard to get in. I heard the lock rattle at the hasp, and then it was silent for a few minutes. My first instinct was to head out the way I came in, but what if the creature was trying to scare me into coming out where it could reach me? What if it were just waiting for me to poke my head out so it could grab me? I took a tentative step toward the opening to peek outside, and then froze again as it hit the doors hard. Looking at the garage doors, I could see something massive moving on the other side through the planks of the door. It reached way up high, and then something crashed into the door, and I saw its claws appear through the wood. It was going to tear the door apart. As it hit the door several more times, its claws came through the door each time, and I heard the lock and hasp hit the ground as the beast swiped it away. Backing up slowly, I knew it would figure out how to pull the door open any second, and I needed to find someplace to hide. Then the double garage door swung open wide, and I saw my dad standing there with a crowbar. He looked at me puzzled for a minute before speaking. "How'd you get in here?" he asked curiously. I pointed at the opening in the wall and watched as he looked over in realization. "So what were you doing in here?" he asked. "Just exploring," I said as I headed out the door in freedom. "I'll be out by my fort." He watched me go by and stepped into the garage as I made my way to the field. I heard him muttering something, but paid little attention as I was now about to mount the hinges and door on my fort. I placed one side of each hinge on the door, with one near the top and the other near the bottom, and nailed them in place. Standing the door in the opening, I placed a piece of wood under it to get it off the ground and nailed the hinges to the side of the opening. Removing the wood underneath, I swung the door to test it, pleased at how well it worked. Going inside, I pulled the door closed and sat on the bucket. As I watched, the door slowly began to swing open, and I realized I needed some kind of latch. Grabbing the piece of wood that I had used to hold the door up, I nailed it to the door, even with the edge. When I pulled the door closed, I was able to rotate the wood and latch the door. It was perfect! Well, almost perfect. Now there was a distinct lack of light inside the fort, as there were no openings other than the cracks around the door. My eyes adjusted pretty well, but it was still very dim. Thinking about it, I needed to make a window or two for light. But how? I didn't have a saber saw, and even if I did, there was no power in the fort. I determined this was something I was going to have to research later and would have to be satisfied by the light coming in through the open door or a flashlight until then. My thoughts were interrupted by an annoying screeching noise. "Kevin, are you in there?" my brother asked from outside the door. I had started making notes about future research needs on my map and ignored him. The door rattled as he tried to open it, and then I saw him looking through the crack in the jamb at me. "I can see you're in there," he whined. "Let me in or I'm going to tell Mom." I growled as loud and low as I could to imitate a monster and rushed forward to rattle the door. Startled, Mark squealed and ran off yelling for Mom. I laughed and completed my notes. Once my notes were complete, I went outside the fort and nailed another piece of wood at the top of the door opening so that I could use it to latch the door from the outside. Latching it, I went back to the garage to see what my dad was doing. Inside the garage, my dad was busy brushing the dust off of everything he found on the workbench, and then brushing the table before putting things back in an order that made sense to him. He didn't bother with a dustpan and broom, but merely brushed it all onto the floor, since the floor was dirt anyway. This was the second inside area I had observed this morning, which had a dirt floor instead of concrete. Thinking about it, even the road coming to the house was unpaved. Was there some secret family conspiracy against concrete? I would need to know more. I casually observed the items he had revealed, making mental notes of interesting items for future use, like a handsaw, a brace with several drill bits that looked to have potential for drilling holes in sizes I might need in the future, and a larger mallet. There were actually quite a few interesting tools I intended to use for something in the future. What exactly I would use them for, I was not sure, but I knew they would come in handy eventually, and it was always good to know where to find the tool you needed before you needed it. The garage was very bright now with the big doors open, and I took advantage of this fact to thoroughly observe my surroundings. There were more car parts hanging on the walls, as well as some ancient-looking fishing gear hanging from the rafters. Of most importance, though, I saw a wooden ladder built into the far back corner that led to a loft above. I was really curious what could be found in the loft. About that time, I began to hear banging on wood and my brother hollering outside in the field. My dad went to the door to investigate what was wrong with his youngest son, and I took advantage of his not looking at me to climb the ladder into the loft. Sitting on the dusty boards of the loft, I looked out a crack in the wall to see my brother trying in vain to gain entry to the fort. He didn't even notice the latch on top. "What are you doing, Mark?" Dad asked. "I'm trying to get inside the fort with Kevin," Mark whined back. "He locked me out." "Kevin is in the garage with me," Dad said, and turned to look back into the garage. Watching from above, I had to cover my mouth to stop them being able to hear me snickering as Mark joined him at the door and looked around for me. "He's not here," Mark whined. "Maybe he went in the house to get a drink or something," Dad said, and watched as Mark ran off to the house once again. Dad stepped outside and lit a smoke as he looked around the farm. While his back was turned, I quietly made my way down the ladder and stood looking at the tools on the bench. There hadn't been anything interesting on the planks in the loft, so I lost interest quickly, although I did keep in mind that it was a good place to hide from Mark. After a few minutes, Dad turned back to the garage and looked around. He didn't seem to notice me standing next to the workbench at first, and when he did, I heard him start to speak in a tone that I always knew meant work for me. "I was thinking," he began, "we could take all these old car parts off the walls, clean this place up, and I could run a shop in here." "I think I hear Mom calling me," I said, as I made a beeline for the door and didn't stick around to hear the rest. Once safely away from the garage and its promise of work to come, I moseyed across the backyard in the direction of my grandfather's house. Peeking in the kitchen window as I went by, I could see my mother sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and cigarettes. She didn't notice me, and I saw no sign of Mark. Happily, I entered the trail in the woods and followed it to my grandfather's place. The woods thinned as I entered his backyard, and immediately to my right was his garden. It seemed to stretch on forever, and I saw him on the far side stuffing hay around some plants. "Hi, Grandpa, what are you doing?" I asked as I strolled up. "Bedding my strawberries to make sure they don't get too cold at night or too hot during the day," he said, standing and stretching. "So how are you this morning?" "I'm okay," I said. "I finally found a door and some hinges to put on my fort this morning." He nodded and walked over to sit beneath a large tree. Looking up, I realized it was the same kind of tree that was in the front yard of my house, but not as large. "What kind of tree is that?" I asked, pointing to it. "It's like the one at our house." "That is a catalpa tree," he said. "Best fish bait in the world for bluegill and sunfish." I looked at him with my head cocked to the side. "Fish eat trees?" "No," he laughed. "In the early summer, catalpa worms show up and feed on the tree before they turn into moths and fly away. Catalpa worms are excellent fish bait. Some even call them catfish candy." I considered this for a few moments while I looked over his garden. There were many rows of plants which had started to grow there. Some only had a little sprout, while others had a few leaves already. I was just about to ask Grandpa what I would need to do to start my own garden when I heard my mom calling for me from up the hill. "I gotta go, Grandpa," I said, turning to leave. "Are you going to Aunt Florence for lunch?" "Not today," he said. "Grandma brought me a plate from church this morning, and I'm going to eat with her. But I'll see you soon, especially after you guys move into the house." "Okay, bye, Grandpa," I said, and headed off up the hill. Dad was in the kitchen washing his hands, and Mom was sitting on a chair on the back porch. Mark was sitting on the floor beside her and gave me a cross look. I guess he was mad because he never found me. "Where were you?" my mother asked. "I was at Grandpa's looking at his garden." "Well, go in and wash up so we can go have lunch," she said, and pointed to the kitchen. I washed up and went back out on the porch, drying my hands on my pants. She just looked at me and shook her head. If we were at home, I knew she would be telling me to change clothes, but I had no clothes here yet. I followed my parents to my aunt's house, and we all sat at a big table outside her back door under a porch roof. The food was even better than the night before, and I ate until I was overstuffed. As I ate, I listened to the grown-ups talking and thought for a few moments we wouldn't be moving into the farm when my mother said she would not live in a house without a bathroom. My aunt and dad talked about it, and it was decided he would build a bathroom in the house and install a septic system, since the cost to tie into the city sewer was expensive. When the meal was done, my mother said she had to get home to do laundry for the coming week. My dad was about to remind her that it was spring break, but she gave him the look. There was no denying the look. Even as a boy, I knew better than to challenge the look. It was Mom's most effective way of putting her foot down. I remember one time when I woke from a nap and headed into the living room to watch TV when I was 5. As I came around the corner, my mother looked up from where she was sitting and gave me the look. To this day, I'm still not sure why, because I had taken a nap as told. Perhaps it was not long enough to suit her. Either way, she gave me the look, and I immediately bolted back to my room and dove for the bed. The look had so affected me that I miscalculated my launch trajectory and intercepted the bedpost face first, resulting in a diagonal cut at the corner of my eye. I rubbed the scar at the corner of my eye in memory as we got up from the table. My parents thanked my aunt for lunch, and we said our goodbyes before piling into the truck for the ride home. Sitting in my spot in the middle of the back seat with my full belly, I began to feel drowsy as the hum of the truck relaxed me. Our trip to the farm had actually turned out to be quite the adventure. I built a fort, explored new things, and even learned a thing or two. Dozing off, I found myself happily looking forward to moving to the farm. I hope you enjoyed this look into campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.